Please note today's session is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Thank you very much, and on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the July Advanced Topics in Implementation Science webinar. Today we are delighted to welcome our presenter, Dr. Jeffrey Curran, who will be joined by our own Dr. David Chambers, who will moderate the session. A very brief word about logistics, and we'll be off. We ask that if you are not already on mute, to please keep your phone on mute for the duration of today's presentation. As mentioned, it is being recorded, and muting all lines will help us to avoid any background noise. We encourage questions. They can be submitted by using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of the WebEx interface. Type your question in the provided field and hit submit. Feel free to submit your questions at any time, but we'll be opening the session for questions when the speakers have finished. Without any further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Chambers.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. As many of you who have been part of these webinars in the past have noticed, this has been our attempt to try and go beyond some of the overviews around dissemination implementation research into more advanced topics. A number of the training programs that we've been able to do, whether it's technical assistance workshops or week-long trainings, have been able to give I would say a smattering of different topics, exposure to a number of different topics, but sometimes we don't have as much depth to be able to go into specific discussions, to have Q&As around specific models, around specific designs, et cetera. Last month, we completed a whole series of webinars that were focusing on different dissemination implementation research frameworks. With Jeff Curran's presentation, we're kicking off a newer series that delves into different research designs. In recent years, at least from my what I've picked up, there's been increased interest in this idea of how might you be able to learn both about the effectiveness of different interventions while also looking at the implementation of those interventions in practice. And really, Jeff Curran, who you'll see a nice smiling photo of right here, who's the director of the Center for Implementation Research and a professor at UAMS, also involved in the VA, has been leading the field in helping us to think through different ways of combining studies that are both looking at the effectiveness of a given intervention with a range of information about how those interventions are implemented and with what strategies in community and clinical practice. So the way that this will go, Jeff will give his presentation. As Sarah had mentioned, we would love to have questions at all times, and we'll get to those at the conclusion of his presentation. So he'll start presenting, and then we'll use as much time to answer whatever questions you have. As Sarah had mentioned, this is intended to be archived, so if you want to tell anyone about it down the road, it'll be there for your pleasure, and we'll also try and link to a discussion on our Research to Reality website where you can continue to ask questions or share your thoughts about this as well as other topics. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jeff, and thanks in advance for the wisdom that you're about to impart.
Sure, great. Thanks very much. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, I see that it's working. Okay, well, thank you, David. I think it's kind of fun for you folks to sort of have the first episode of the designs-focused webinars be on a nice, messy topic of hybrid designs. So I think that I will start with providing some of the arguments that we originally proposed in the medical care paper on this topic, which was published in 2012. And so I think that sort of the key argument that we proposed was that we thought that the speed of moving research findings into routine adoption could be improved by considering these hybrid designs that combine elements of effectiveness and implementation research. if indeed the goal of translational science is to speed that process, we were looking, at potential ways to merge traditional effectiveness trial designs with implementation research. In other words, we might not need to wait for perfect effectiveness data before moving into implementation research, and that it might be very possible and worthwhile to backfill, if you will, effectiveness data while we are looking at and testing implementation strategies. And we will talk about today sort of the numerous situations where there is momentum from varying levels to move to implementation and to support rollouts of interventions that really have not yet received a full look, a full attention, from the effectiveness standpoint. And we also argue that we can and should study clinical effectiveness as it relates to the fidelity of implementation. We can certainly expect in many cases that as fidelity to implementation, to the uptake of an intervention varies, we might well expect the outcomes of that intervention to vary, and if so, should we be trying to look at that? Let me offer some more introductory thoughts on this topic. Researchers were already doing these kinds of blends of these trial designs and approaches, really well before some of my colleagues and I started to speak and write about hybrid designs per se. In the paper in 2012, we were trying to bring some attention to the issues surrounding these complicated combinations, along with trying to provide some direction, examples in the published literature at the time, and also some recommendations for moving forward into this area. Since then, we have seen more and more people trying hybrid designs. They're writing grants, turning those in. They're being funded. They're publishing protocols, results, and lessons learned. And as a result of that, my colleagues and I from the first paper have recently begun a process to work on a couple of papers, we think, to sort of revise and extend, our remarks, if you will, from the earlier paper. And I will present some of these sort of new ideas on the hybrid design towards the end of the talk. I think I need to try to cover a few of the terms and how I will use them today to make sure that we are being clear. In the sort of hybrid design context, when we're talking about interventions really at two different levels, the language can actually get, quite complicated. In the title today and some of the slides, I will, talk about clinical interventions, but we're really referring to a range of prevention interventions, public health, and other kinds of intervention. Sometimes it's hard to say clinical/prevention/public health at every mention of interventions. So I will sometimes use only clinical, but I'm referring, really to sort of a wider group there. I will use the term intervention to refer to the clinical/prevention practice that we have an interest in exploring. And today I will largely use the term strategy to refer to the implementation support activities/tools that we have an interest in exploring. Both are really interventions whose effectiveness we are interested in trying to learn about or demonstrate. But in the hybrid design context, it can get confusing. In this talk, I will usually use the term effectiveness when referring to the outcomes of clinical prevention interventions. Okay. The notion of these hybrid designs really came as a reaction to what we were seeing as sort of the traditional research pipeline, which is depicted here, where there's a period of time to be focused on efficacy studies on interventions. When there's enough positive evidence there, we then move to effectiveness studies on those interventions, widening their scope, testing them under more real-world conditions in less controlled conditions. And once we see strong effectiveness data there, we then move on to implementation research. And in the late 1990s, early 2000s, folks like Ken Wells and Russ Glasgow and others were talking about some of the ways that efficacy and effectiveness research designs could be blended or combined to try to speed that process. And about 10 years later, some of us were starting to ask similar questions on this relationship or gap, if you will, between effectiveness studies on interventions and implementation research. And so our hybrids then that we've presented here are sort of spatially fitting in this sort of gap area here, okay? So in the 2012 paper, we proposed 3 hybrid types that occupied that gap in the previous pipeline between effectiveness research studies and implementation research. We coined a hybrid type 1, which is more closely situated to effectiveness research, where here the main goal of the study is to test the effectiveness of a clinical/prevention intervention, while at the same time spending some time and effort observing and gathering information on implementation during the trial and trying to do some preparatory work to understand the needs, the barriers that might be associated with implementation after the study in sort of preparatory work towards developing potential future implementation interventions. If I might skip to hybrid type 3, which is sort of the inverse, where here the primary aim of a hybrid type 3 study is to test implementation strategies in a randomized or otherwise controlled manner, while at the same time gathering information on the clinical/prevention outcomes that are resulting from these implementation efforts. In the middle, we have sort of the most complicated hybrid type 2 designs, which we thought about as a more equal look or test at both clinical/preventive interventions and implementation strategies, okay? So I'll try to go into some more detail on each. I've just moved the slide, and there doesn't seem to be, oh, I guess it's happening sort of one at a time. I've already sort of done the definition, you know, here. It's large, for a hybrid type 1 design, it's largely testing the clinical intervention with a secondary aim on implementation information. And as we have seen in operationalizations, these projects are pretty much 80–85% effectiveness trial, with an aim at the end which proposes some kind of process evaluation or other evaluation of implementation during the trial in a preparatory way to finding out what might be necessary in a future implementation strategy test. In the paper, we tried to give some guidance as to when we thought these hybrid types might be sort of best indicated. And for the hybrid type 1, we were thinking that in the ideal case that some effectiveness data were already available, but that the intervention would be more likely to, you know, move towards implementation rapidly if key implementation factors were explored, you know, in a hybrid 1 trial. So a hybrid 1 trial might not necessarily be the first effectiveness trial in a, you know, in a certain area, but they might occur after some effectiveness data has already been indicated. And we also thought that sort of safety issues should, you know, already have been dealt with, and that we aren't exploring implementation of interventions which might have some safety concerns still. I will mention two examples briefly. The Zollner et al. Paper sort of included with the packet of papers for today's talk. So this is a pragmatic trial of 2 interventions aimed at reducing consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. What's really nice here is that the intervention planning for this trial involved discussions and choices being made around future implementation issues. So they were trying to create intervention elements that were more likely to be implementable around low startup costs, for example. And they chose a mixed method process evaluation of the reach that they achieved in the trial, meaning how many eligible patients that they were actually able to reach and provide the intervention to, but also data on implementation and how often and how well the expected intervention behaviors were provided. A second example comes from myself and other colleagues who did an effectiveness trial of the CALM intervention, a multifaceted intervention for anxiety disorders in primary care clinics. And in this case also, the intervention planning involved trying to forecast implementability and to forecast some of the barriers that might be faced in the development of the intervention itself. But there was a process evaluation that happened towards the end of the trial and just after. Ours was largely qualitative, focused on multiple stakeholder interviews, providers, nurses, clinic staff, patients, trying to get a sense of how implementation went during the trial. Were the implementation supports provided enough? What more might be necessary for these clinics in the study to keep doing the intervention after the study was over, and also to get their recommendations on what new clinics who weren't part of the study might need relative to implementation strategies and supports. I will move to hybrid type 2 designs. And so, here the expected focus, is a dual focus. And it could come sort of in an equally focused factorial type design where there could be a clinical prevention randomized effectiveness trial nested in a randomized implementation trial at the provider or clinic level, for example. And there are some of those kinds of studies out there, but not too many for reasons that I might hit on briefly later. The other kind of hybrid type 2s that we talked about in the initial paper do seem to be the kind that are most talked about and proposed now, which are having a clinical trial, randomized patient-level trial nested in a pilot study of an implementation strategy. So the implementation strategy that is being explored from a pilot level, feasibility, acceptability. It's a non-randomized element of the larger study. For indications here that we offered for moving in to the type 2 area was that there should be clinical/prevention effectiveness data available, though perhaps not in the context or population of interest for your trial. And if there is some there too, great. There also should be data already on barriers, facilitators to implementation, some of that pre-implementation work to help develop either the pilot or more fully formed implementation strategy really needs to have already been done. And we also came up with this term of implementation momentum. And with that, we were really trying to talk about the context at the system or policy level, and, you know, is there a situation within a healthcare system, VA system, a national healthcare system, or other sort of policy context where there seems to be an appetite and plans coming up for mandates and rollouts that, you know, will be possibly coming from more of a top-down approach. And in that context, might it be possible to use a hybrid design, either a 2 or a 3, to try to contribute, you know, to that rollout while also collecting the still needed effectiveness data? For this one, I will give one example. It's from Cully et al. In 2012. They proposed a clinical trial of a brief psychotherapy for treating depression and anxiety in the VA. Already very good evidence of these kinds of interventions, but not in the brief context. And they proposed a patient randomized trial in the context of a pilot implementation strategy which had 3 components to it: online training, audit and feedback, and facilitation. And so the analysis for the patient randomized trial was sort of the classic intent to treat analysis of those clinical outcomes. But at the same time, they had an analysis arm around feasibility, acceptability, and what they call preliminary effectiveness of the implementation strategy. So they were collecting data on, you know, knowledge acquisition from their online training. They were measuring and tracking fidelity of these providers to the manualized therapy, and making adjustments and intervening among providers who were struggling with lower fidelity. And I'll touch later on sort of the complexities that this kind of design adds, you know, when fidelity is not, quote, unquote, assured as in effectiveness trials, but in these hybrid models where that's more of an outcome that's being observed, and how to best capture that while still trying to get quality and good effectiveness data. They also had a qualitative component on implementability. They tried to measure the time spent, you know, delivering the implementation strategy, and they also measured sustainability of the brief CBT after the trial. And all of this was openly framed as preparatory to a future implementation trial of this strategy that they were pilot testing. So in their frame, sort of, the next step was a much higher focus on the implementation strategy and trying to test that in a controlled way, whether that was a hybrid type 3 or not. So moving on to the hybrid type 3 designs, again, what we're talking about here is, a primary focus on testing implementation strategies while at the same time trying to collect data on clinical outcomes of the intervention. Some of the hybrid type 3s that we've seen thus far are quite large from the sample size standpoint at the clinic or provider level, which often means that primary data collection on the health outcomes, prevention, clinical outcomes are very difficult. And so one of the questions, here is, how much quality outcomes data can you get from large databases or medical records to best inform the goals of a hybrid type 3 design. Relative to some of the indications for when these designs might be appropriate, the first listed here is in the context of a high-level need for implementation despite a limited evidence base. So, in other words, a strong momentum context for implementation sooner rather than later, some form of a mandate to implement something in a large system when the effectiveness evidence just really isn't quite there. And I can say from working in the VA that this is a context which actually happens relatively frequently. And my example coming up, or one of the two coming up, really exemplify this situation. We also talked about hybrid type 3s being useful when the clinical/prevention intervention data have been available and is strong, but the effects are suspected to be vulnerable to implementation fidelity. And this might more be the case with complicated, complex clinical/prevention interventions, and/or if the implementation strategies are also multi-faceted. And so, our argument here is, if it's expected to vary, try to collect as much of those outcomes data as possible to try to track those outcomes to the implementation variation. We also said, too, that for these hybrid type 3 designs, that there really should be already data indicating that the implementation strategies that will be tested are reasonably feasible, acceptable, and supportive in the context of note. So having that pilot data around feasibility, et cetera, is really necessary before moving into a hybrid type 3 design. So I have two examples here. One is from the BA from Hilborn et al. So this was sort of exactly the context mentioned on the last slide, that there was a system-level mandated rollout that was going to be supported by VA on reengage and outreach program for veterans with serious mental illness who had been lost to care. And so these folks were able to partner, with this rollout mandate to do a study comparing a standard implementation strategy with one with enhancements. I won't really go in to what those are, but one of the really cool things about this trial is that it was an adaptive trial at the implementation trial level. So sites started with the standard implementation strategy, and those that failed under an initial attempt to reach a certain preset fidelity level were then randomized to the enhanced strategy to then see to what extent that moved the dial among sites who did not do well with the more basic approach. And hopefully for this webinar or series, a future topic will be devoted to these adaptive trials, because they're really very, very interesting and really very, very helpful. So in this study, the main outcomes were certainly around implementation, the extent of the behaviors of locating and trying to contact veterans that were part of the intervention. They also had a very cool opportunity to collect at all of the 150 plus VA programs that were part of this, to collect context variables to help sort of predict who might do better or in the standard condition, and what kinds of programs needed the extra implementation support. And then they also had qualitative barriers from these providers who were charged to do the intervention on sort of, barriers, facilitators to implementation. The secondary outcomes were focused on sort of the main goals of the intervention, looking at percentages of veterans who were reengaged, measuring a range of service utilization, with those really being used, those data really being used as proxies, if you will, for clinical outcomes. So they didn't have in these large databases the kinds of direct outcome measures for serious mental illness, but they did have a lot of services use data, and they could come up with service use profiles which seemingly, can be argued as indicating more positive outcomes, and other service utilization profiles that might indicate less positive outcomes. And they did have mortality measures. I will mention one that colleagues of mine here at UAMS are working on right now for the October deadline, actually. We're looking at a regional implementation trial here in Arkansas of a standard versus standard plus implementation strategies to promote the uptake of behavioral activation and evidence-based practice for depression, but in this case, lay providers in churches are being trained to do this intervention, and as of right now, the pilot data there on that effectiveness is strong. So in this study, we are proposing, main outcomes around adoption and fidelity. Are folks offering the number of sessions? Are enough people showing up to, receive care? Are the lay providers providing the manualized depression intervention sort of with good fidelity? But the secondary outcomes in this case, because it's relatively small, 35 churches with only 5 to 10 folks in each group, we are actually able to do primary data collection around depressive symptoms, activities, and quality of life. Okay, so I will move into the last few slides here to talk about some of the challenges that folks have been facing in trying to, write these hybrid protocols and to get them funded. And many of these points I will cover are not actually in the current paper, but are new issues that we will be writing about more. Perhaps one of the largest challenges is on this issue of evidence, and we are certainly finding that the comfort level with these hybrid designs varies certainly around the issue of evidence, and we are seeing, debates, very understandable and very good debates around whether doing implementation research and testing implementation strategies before a solid record of effectiveness data is actually a good idea, and some folks, are predisposed in the negative on this. Even among people who entertain that hybrids might be a good idea, we have seen debates on a case-by-case basis on what level of clinical effectiveness data is enough to propose the hybrid design that you want to do right now. So what level of indirect evidence is acceptable? And in some of my own proposals and those of colleagues and other people, we have seen, grant reviews varying at times widely on this. And we also have cases, too, where what do you do in cases where the quality of effectiveness data may never be, quote, unquote, strong, when you can't randomize to interventions, for example, suicide prevention interventions. We're seeing challenges, too, around control versus flexibility and sort of what to do in cases, for example, in that Cully Hybrid 2 trial when fidelity to the intervention is being allowed to vary, and how do we measure and try to control for that variation, and how does that affect the clinical outcomes data? Certainly with with power if you're adding implementation sort of aims and measures to your effectiveness trial, you will likely have less time, money, and budget to do those trials, and vice versa with hybrid type 3s and certainly 2s. For outcome measures, you know, to what extent can we collect useful effectiveness outcomes in type 3s when those are not, when, you know, those patients are not being randomized, and we might not have the time or money to collect you know, more solid primary evidence. And also, too, with most of these hybrid designs, we see a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods, and, you know, one has to have on your team the expertise, you know, to carry those out. I have a few more slides, but I have a feeling that I should probably wrap up. So, as I mentioned earlier, we're thinking about some new papers now, trying to document the current use of hybrids, the challenges reported, document typical study designs, trade-offs, measures. We would like to come up with some reporting guidelines or minimum standards, if you will, for each of these hybrids. We want to talk some about how models and theories of implementation might relate to these hybrids. We are seeing a lot of people using the REAIM framework in these hybrids to sort of guide the data collection. At the moment, we are pondering, arguing, or pushing maybe to include implementation concerns in more effectiveness trials. You know, if most effectiveness trials by definition are precursors to implementation efforts, then should we possibly be seeing more hybrid type 1s? For hybrid type 2s, we're not seeing a whole lot of dual randomized, and in those we are seeing pretty simple interventions and simple uptake strategies being tested, sort of unique element models there. And we're wondering if, you know, most of these, you know, are or should lean more towards the hybrid 1 side or hybrid 3 side. And I will close with this. At the 2014 D&I meeting, there was a session there on hybrid designs and hybrid studies. And at the end of the formal talks during the Q&A, somebody got up there and said, well, when wouldn't we want to collect clinical outcomes during an implementation trial? In other words, like flipping it on its head, why wouldn't we want to do this? And it sort of called into question an assumption that we were making at the start of talking about these, that there likely comes a time when we don't need to worry about the clinical effectiveness data anymore, and it's so good that we should only focus on uptake. But then you read papers like, you know, David's paper from 2013, where he and colleagues are talking about, and I think quite rightly so, that interventions and implementation strategies are not frozen, or they shouldn't be. And we shouldn't only expect that as we move to do implementation that their effectiveness might drop, and that indeed adaptations that happen, you know, during implementation and varying by implementation strategy could see improved outcomes. So, you know, trying to flip the question on its head and say, well, you know, when might we not need to look at these outcomes, as possibly we should try to look at them in these hybrid, 3 trials and beyond as much as possible. So with that, I will stop, and hopefully there's some time left for some questions.
Jeff, thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. As a quick reminder, questions can be submitted using the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the provided field and hit submit. And I see we have a couple dropping in, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to David.
Yeah, so in case someone doesn't have access to seeing the questions in front of you, I will just ask it, and Jeff, it'd be great to get your take on it.
Sure.
So here's one from Margaret Farrell. I'm intrigued by your discussion around evidence and appreciate your bringing it up. At what point do you begin to determine that the original intervention was strong enough that the implementation, for any number of reasons, is less effective, and how can a hybrid design help tease that out?
Can you repeat that for me one more time?
Sure. So at what point do you begin to determine that an original intervention was strong enough, but it's the implementation that's less effective? And can a hybrid design help, again, distinguishing between what of the overall impact, I would think, on say, individual outcomes stems from the effectiveness of the intervention versus the strategy through which it was implemented?
Right. Well, I mean, I think that you would see that, you know, in a trial that is measuring implementation, fidelity, and outcomes. And if you are seeing fidelity vary and you are seeing outcomes vary, then I think that that's what you're seeing. You might see fidelity vary, but you might not see clinical outcomes vary, and in that sense, maybe that intervention is more of a robust intervention to its fidelity. But I think that's a very good question, and I think that these kinds of designs, you know, could be very useful to try to explore that and actually have data to support it.
And it probably, I would think, might also be helpful where you have an ability to look at the mechanisms as to, you know, what were the mechanisms that might have led the intervention to have an effect, but also what were the mechanisms that might have underlined the potential effectiveness of the implementation strategy.
Right, right.
Again, yeah.
And you know, how the implementation strategies might have been more or less effective at bringing to fidelity the activities or key mechanisms of the original intervention.
Sure, right, that makes sense. It looks like we've got a question and an example that's coming, so we'll let the questioner finish putting what they've got in. I was wondering, I did have a question, your take for the group in terms of what you might see as key decision points for investigators who are interested in hybrid designs, and are there specific ways in which they might decide either to opt into this kind of a design or opt out? Any advice that you have for folks who would be saying, this sounds really interesting, how do I identify what might be the right circumstances?
You know, I think that the key issue, or one key issue, is sort of your read of the effectiveness data that are already out there, and how they may or may not relate to the context that you have interest in studying them in. And I would say generally that if there's already a number of effectiveness studies in some varying contexts that are showing, you know, similar or good effectiveness results, and you might be contemplating a similar or same intervention in a new context or in a new population, that might be a good time to look at a hybrid design where one might argue that the current strength in these other varied contexts are strong, and we have strong enough reason to believe that we will see similar effectiveness in this new context that we know or we expect will have some differing implementation challenges. So we want to make progress and move forward quickly to look at these implementation issues while still being sensitive to providing effectiveness data. But it might not necessarily be the case where we have to do another only effectiveness trial of screening and brief intervention for alcohol in primary care when maybe there's enough data there, for one example, for, maybe we don't need another sole effectiveness trial in this mini variant of population or context without looking at seemingly the key issue for that intervention at the moment, which is implementation.
So Jeff, thank you so much for those answers. And I know we have more questions coming in on the WebEx platform, but to be cognizant of folks' time and upcoming 3 p.m. meetings, I want to go ahead and say a big thank you to both David and Jeff, and to let folks know that your feedback is important to us. We encourage you to complete our online evaluation, a link to which will be sent to you in an email shortly. As mentioned, we would like to continue this discussion from the webinar online at researchtoreality.cancer.gov, where you can engage with the speakers and other participants through discussion forums and posts. And to those who have posted questions that have gone unanswered, we will be following up with you via email, and we'll be going ahead and posting those on researchtoreality.cancer.gov. So thank you again for joining us for this month's webinar. We hope to see you soon, and you may disconnect at this time.
I also want to say, too, thank you for having me here. For anybody who has questions that haven't been answered, please feel free to contact me via email, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, and my thanks also, Jeff, to you, and we're very appreciative. We'll keep watching, and I think everyone who's still on the webinar will keep watching the space to see the next steps that you're taking with the hybrid design. So thanks very much.
Absolutely, great. Thank you so very, very much.